about that pesky algae?
Yeah,
especially this.
yeah. I mean, yeah. So that
Control.
probably of all of the pond, problems from pond keepers that we deal with when we're sort of helping customers, algae is the most common, and it is a real problem. And the conditions in a garden pond are just perfect. Algae is a primitive plant. Lots of different types of algae, but we can really crudely split the algae that are problems in ponds into two groups. There's the single-celled algae. So you can't see the individual algae with the naked eye yourself, but you can, under a microscope, you'll see these very clear single-celled organisms that are just suspended in the water column. Now, a small population of single-celled algae in the pond is absolutely essential. It's sort of the base of the food chain in the pond. Then there's, small, tiny little crustaceans and things will then feed on that algae, and then fish fry and smaller, other invertebrates will feed on those tiny crustaceans, and then fish will be at the top of the food chain. So without that algae, the pond would be utterly dead. The trouble is, when we get an absolute bloom in the growth of this single-celled algae, the pond just goes a horrible green colour. And when we can't see the fish, and can't really see anything in the pond, it just looks like we've got a puddle of pea soup in the garden, which is not the aesthetic that we wanted. So that's the green water.
It's not beautiful for us to look at, but for the fish?
With a few caveats, they love it. Yeah, the fish love that. Yeah, because these are carp family. The majority of pond fishes, goldfish, and carp, and orf and rudd and things, they're all carp family fish, and they prefer sluggish, murky water. And the security that murkiness gives. A heavy bloom of algae in the pond can start to affect the water quality. And that can then be bad for the fish. But the murkiness of the water would actually find our pond fish quite like. It's us that don't like the algae too much.
And if we don't like it, we're going to get rid of it.
It's gone. It's gone.
We're in control.
Yes, indeed. But it's the same thing. Same thing if you're thinking of your lawn in your garden. We want it to be super flat with those lovely, dark and light green stripes, and we want a lovely lawn, don't we? But that's very, very unnatural, incredibly unnatural. We want a monoculture, just a grass. If there's a buttercup or a daisy growing in there, heaven forbid, so we put broadleaf weed killer on there. We're making something that's not natural at all, but it's the aesthetic.
So would you suggest that people just allow some algae and try and control it, or is that an impossibility, or is it like you have it or you don't?
I think we're at a bit of a cusp in what, we're at a bit of a sort of a difference in why we keep in the pond. If we're looking after a wildlife pond, then we're going to want a fair bit of algae to be then setting up that food chain. But really, we're not. We're keeping a fish pond. If we're keeping a fish pond to keep our goldfish or some koi carp in there or some golden orf or something like that, for a lot of pond keepers, it's the fish that are the thing they want to see. And maybe, we want some lovely pretty lilies on there and stuff like that as well. So then really the algae is taking away from the beauty of those lilies. And But I think my analogy of a lawn, really, it's artificial, but it's sort of beautiful, and it's what we want. But for some people, they wouldn't want a lawn, and they'd want a lovely, wild bit of meadow. So it's what one wants. If one's wanting to see the lovely fish that we put in there, and we've got these ornamental fish because they're beautiful colours and interesting behaviours and things, then we're going to need clear water to see that.
Yeah.
That green water algae gone. So the other type of algae is the filamentous sort of hair algae or blanket weed, which again, a small amount in the pond is absolutely essential. When goldfish or carp are spawning, they will go and spawn in that, in sort of, in amongst that filamentous hair algae. That's essential for tadpoles as well. You remember tadpoles at the early stage of their life cycle, they're herbivorous. So they're feeding on filamentous algae and the green water algae as well, emphasising the importance. It's not that the algae has got into my pond and it's a problem, it's that the growth of algae has bloomed. We've got too much of it, and we want to keep its population in check. So the things that the algae needs, very simple really. It needs sunlight to grow, and it needs nutrients. And those nutrients come from the waste of the fish. It's a bit like a farmer spreading animal manure onto a field to fertilize the field. Well, we've got the fish's waste going into the water, which is then increasing the nutrient levels in the water, which is fertilizing the water. We've got the sunlight over the pond, so the algae is going to grow. If there's nutrients and sunlight, it will grow. So those nutrients, primarily nitrates and phosphates, are the key nutrients that freshwater algae need in order to go from them being a sort of low level in the pond to a bloom. And
how, so what product would people use to control that growth?
Depends on the type of algae, really. I mean, for green water algae, by far the best way of keeping green water algae under control is with an ultraviolet clarifier. Now, we're in quite a good position here because we can be nice and impartial. Tetra don't make ultraviolet clarifiers. We don't make anything to do with ultraviolet clarifiers, but I'm here saying you need an ultraviolet clarifier. So that's really good impartial advice. What the ultraviolet clarifier is doing is it's sort of, the water is being pumped through a chamber where it's in, the water is in very close contact with a UV light bulb, and that UV light then is at a specific wavelength that then interferes with proteins on the cell wall of the algae, and that making those proteins very sticky. So the algal cells will clump together, so those clumped algae can then be removed in the further chambers of the sort of sponges and brushes.
And what about algothin?
Algothin is more useful against the blanket weed. It's going to have an effect against the green water algae, but the effect of an ultraviolet clarifier is far better. The trouble is, with an ultraviolet clarifier working well, it's going to take out the green water algae, giving you nice clear water in which the sun is still shining down on it, and there's still the nutrients in the water, so the blanket weed will start to grow. And the blanket weed doesn't get pumped through the ultraviolet clarifier. So the one drawback of an ultraviolet clarifier is it makes conditions perfect for blanket weed. So that's when the algothin can really become useful, where that is a approved algicide. Because we're saying it will actually kill the algae, we have to get it approved under the Health and Safety Executive's biocides regulations. And so it's an approved algicide, which has been shown to sort of kill off blanket weed. What we can't do, though, is if we've got a pond absolutely choked with loads and loads of blanket weed, we couldn't then put a pesticide in like you would spray on the weeds on a path, for example. You might get some, a pesticide, and you would, a weed killer, and you'd spray that on the weeds on your path, and you'd expect those weeds to be dead within a day or so. You would not want to do that in a pond. If I had a pond choked full of blanket weed, and I added an algicide which killed it all off in a couple of days, that's going to cause a huge upset to the water quality, huge upset to the ecology of the pond.
So we go back to water quality again.
We do, yes.